Well, as researchers who work in Italy and analyze the conditions of women's work, as well as related social welfare tools, we reflected on this important question, and we must admit, some concerns about it. No doubt the health emergency has highlighted all shortcomings and difficulties concerning gender equality and access to the labor market in terms of equity, security, and balance. However, this emergency has also revealed how the entire social organization needs to make an effort to rethink urban space and the relationship with the environment at large, as well as mobility, livability, the quality of life, and times of contemporary society. Business, as well as institutions and civil society organizations, are the main actors of this change. We remind you that in Italy, the gender gap in employment rates has always been one of the largest in the EU, around 18%, while the EU average stood at 10%. And in 2018, in southern Italy, only 32.2% of women aged between 15 and 64 were employed. In northern Italy, there were 59.7%, a value that is below the national average in 1977, that was 33.5%. The latest Istat report on labor shows that some 101,000 jobs were lost in the last month of 2020. And in 2020, the decrease of employment concerned women and all age classes, while men were substantially stable. Compared to December 2019, in Italy, the number of employees dropped by 444,000 units, 312,000 of whom were women. Now, the economic recession resulted from the measures taken to contain the spread of COVID-19 seems to affect women more than men, unlike what happened in 28 crises, when job losses mainly concerned the construction and manufacturing industry. This time, women are the ones who bear the brunt of the social and economic fallout of the pandemic. So, what conclusion can we draw from it? We can say that maybe the health emergency and the extremely critical employment situation caused by the pandemic have been used to lead women to get back to care and domestic work, considering the need to have an in-home care option due to the critical challenges facing the healthcare and education system. This situation clearly reveals Italy's deeply rooted structural gaps and the cultural idea that women have always been a cornerstone of the Italian welfare system. So from this point of view, we must say that the idea of pursuing a work-life balance is central, also in terms of a cultural and political need to consider and recognize each other equally and reciprocally in need of care, or capable of taking care of each other, within an ecosystem that is eager to redefine our relationship with living beings by creating a different society. On the contrary, the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the persistence of the gender division of care. Men and women coped with the consequences of a new organization of care and working time imposed by social control and smart working measures differently. The gender-based division of care was unbalanced even before the COVID-19 pandemic. It simply made the burden of care fall on every single woman, separating her from the collective context. We are concerned that this situation can encourage the outsourcing of welfare services, resulting in the privatization of healthcare, less public kindergartens, less school canteens, lack of public care services for the elderly. So as a result, mothers will have to quit their jobs in order to shoulder the majority of family caregiving responsibilities, thus relieving the burden on the public sector. Well, so much for the balance. It will represent an apparent saving for the state, but a terrible loss for society as a whole, and for the production of wealth in more complex and general terms. Domestic and care work results in a double work burden for women, for it is still an appendage of male wage labor. The Italian welfare model is based on family, where women, whether they are mothers or daughters, care for children and aging parents in order to make up for the lack of provision of care services. The emphasis continues to be placed on the articulation between spheres of activity rather than on their content. Women continue to be considered different workers and also the only ones to be interested in the issue of conciliation. In addition, today, caring labor is entirely incorporated in a process of devalorization. A woman lacking autonomy, which is currently guaranteed only by wage labor, is a very fragile subject. She's at risk of poverty and violence, including economic violence. This is still a huge problem today. As we have tried to explain, it could set Italian women back decades. This is therefore strategic to reset and recalibrate the lives of all, men and women. Well, the issue of which innovations and which means can support a more equitable management of working time in relation to care burden in order to foster a greater participation in the labor market has distant roots. We would like to clarify that the term welfare today should not only refer to those measures and interventions that tend to guarantee minimal rights and living conditions to social groups living on the margins of society, but it needs to be associated with the well-being of the entire population. Welfare means social well-being, and social well-being is measured in terms of quality of life and social coexistence of all members of a community. In recent years, we have witnessed deep social transformations that have affected social protection systems and led families to develop forms of self-organization. It is a question of updating the welfare systems in the light of the transformations of labor and consequent repercussions in terms of needs and in terms of updating policy interventions. As we have already said, public authorities, civil society, economic actors play a decisive role, especially in relation to schedules that focus on the issue of time and greater flexibility. Institutions, social partners, and businesses can give a substantial impetus in this direction. Taking models of smart working and remote working as an example, without translating them into more intensive, extensive employment. In fact, what today begins to appear as the most important segregation barrier is the temporal availability, which is firmly linked to cultural dynamics and consequent territorial policies. Especially in extraordinary times like this, it seems all too clear that the imbalance must also find forms of compensation. Otherwise, it would give rise to increased inequalities. The challenge of conciliation is, first of all, a challenge of balancing parts of oneself, even before finding a balance between the different activities carried out. A first exercise to find a balance between work and family life is to manage one's time. Any human experience is by its nature limited. It means that although work is essential for a living, it cannot take up one's entire day, invading every physical and mental space, consuming intellectual and psychological energies, and running the risk of compromising one's inner and physical balance, as well as the relationships with others. This is as true for women as it is for men. Time management requires that people take time for themselves, not in an egocentric perspective, but as a prerequisite to develop desires and planning. Personal integration is the prerequisite for building solid interpersonal relationships, so as to actively participate in promoting the common good of society as a whole. Making trade-offs among the different aspects of life, work, family, community, and self, and avoiding that each of these aspects prevail by crushing the identity within to close boundaries of motherhood or professional fulfillment is a task that educational and training institutions should implement, thus contributing to build a society based on freedom of choice. An important step that political and institutional actors can take is to establish a minimum wage at European level. In this regard, we see that European Commission proposal for a directive on adequate minimum wages across member states as an important signal. It would be essential that EU countries, especially countries like Italy, that still do not have any form of minimum wage implemented, by including also non-standard jobs, following the example of the British Low Pay Commission. In Germany, for instance, such measures have significantly reduced wage inequality, raising the wages of low-paid workers, that is, low-skilled workers, women, part-time workers, and those working in small and medium-sized enterprises operating in the third sector. A second exercise to find a balance in time management is to add the word sharing to the term conciliation. What needs to be shared? Well, the roles and responsibilities in the family, above all. Without sharing the tasks of caring for the most fragile, children, the sick, the elderly, conciliation runs the risk of being pure rhetoric and remaining a generic and sporadic exercise in supporting women. But it is also essential, from our point of view, that family and work conciliation aims to overcome the dichotomy employed-unemployed in order to try to attack inequalities that we also register in this field, or at least try not to create new ones. There's no doubt that the availability of family assistance represents a powerful tool for promoting conciliation. However, this introduces a dangerous dualism in society, transforming conciliation into a luxury for those who can afford it, thus unloading the burden on those who cannot. And for this reason, they are forced to give up any conciliation. Another issue is about updating welfare institutions. The current welfare state is the result of a relationship between businesses and labor anchored to the Fordist Pact, to material male wage labor. Measures such as the minimum wage would be able to protect new professional figures employed in intangible production, such as precarious workers, young people, women. Measures such as basic income represent today the main form of contrasting inequalities, and not only in terms of economic needs. A basic income paid on an individual basis rather than on a family basis can represent one of the main tools of emancipation and autonomy for women. It is not by chance that in recent years, the women's movement, not one less, introduced basic income in its feminist plan. For it represents the possibility of socially sharing the burden of lack of concrete opportunities that is too often hastily judged as absence of goals or desires. Obviously, the provision of services remains central. They are the cornerstone of a system that must take utmost account of the well-being and the reproductive health of women. A system that must encourage employment, but also allow people to take their life back. And it's only in this balance there is development, as participation and creativity are encouraged.